This is the Isle of Palms podcast, produced by Island Vibes, the Isle of Palms upscale monthly publication. The Isle of Palms podcast is all about the people, places, and events that make this island a slice of paradise.
Thanks for joining us here. We've got a special guest today, Tommy Hartnett, and together we're documenting history of his terms in D.C. and what he's done for our country. Tommy, you served in the Congress and the House for how many years?
6 years.
That's awesome. Well, you know, we're ever since the first one, we documented your time on living on the Isle of Palms, and now we can go to your time in D.C.
Yep.
So when you were elected, so I know you've got some great stories. So, but you started off as a Democrat,
Right.
and when you were a Democrat, you decided to go towards the Republican Party, and is it called the Blue Dog? Is that what you refer to it as?
Well, what I was telling you, Bill, earlier was that the makeup of the Congress was certainly Republican and Democrat, but some of the Democrats who'd been there for years were from the South, and they never could really make themselves part of the then Democrat Party because it had gone so far to the left at that time that they stayed in the Democrat Party, but the Democrats themselves called them the Blue Dog Democrats because they were not in the fold. Where they got the name Blue Dog from, I really don't know. But they were the ones who were Mississippi, Alabama, South Carolina, Georgia, Tennessee, Kentucky.
And they were more conservative than the Democrat as we know them.
They were, and they were indicative of what the entire Democrat Party had been at that time and in the previous years. If you think about it, it was the Democrats, it was the Republicans, first of all, who freed the slaves. Lincoln with the Emancipation Proclamation. He was a Republican, and the Republicans in the South were anti-slavery. The Democrats weren't. They were conservative, but they weren't.
That's how the South became.
And you cannot deny it. The slavery was a big thing that separated and caused all the South to go from Democrat to Republican.
So, Tommy, as we've talked in the past, Edwards was the person that got you involved in the party.
Correct.
But you have a special event that happened that you kind of told everybody how you felt. Can you describe what I'm talking about?
If I can do it in 25 words or less, Bill, I will. At the time, the Democrats had nominated a fellow by the name of George McGovern, a United States Senator from South Dakota, to be the candidate for president. McGovern was the one who urged a national income for everybody, that the government ought to pay everybody a minimum salary and they didn't have to work for it. Very liberal. It's really liberal for that time, probably not as liberal for this time. But there was something, his whole ideology was something that was foreign to me. I couldn't accept it. And
excuse me for interrupting, Tommy. Now, you were a Democrat at this time.
Correct.
Okay.
I was a Democrat. It had been a Democrat. My father had been a Democrat. His father had been a Democrat. The South were Democrats. Anyway, I was invited to a speech where all the candidates running for re-election to the State House were invited. It was sponsored by the NAACP, and it was downtown Charleston.
And what year was this, Tommy?
This was 1964.
Okay.
Probably sometime in April or May. It was before the Republican primary in 1964, which was held in June of 64. They had all the candidates there, and they were giving them a few minutes to talk, to campaign with this large group, mostly of NAACP members. And the last question they asked each speaker was, who are you going to vote for president? Well, because they were in the midst of a huge Democrat crowd, all of these very conservative members that I was serving with from Charleston, they're going to vote for George McGovern. They're a Democrat from the courthouse to the White House, and they'd never leave the Democrats to go to vote for George McGovern. Well, in my heart, I couldn't vote for George McGovern. I want to be honest with people. So when it was my turn to speak, and I finished, they asked me the same question, who are you going to vote for president, Mr. Hartnett? And I said, I'm voting for Richard Nixon, and you all ought to vote for Richard Nixon too. McGovern has never done anything for the country. He's never done anything for you, and I can't tolerate him. And if my being in the legislature means I've got to vote for George McGovern, I quit. I don't intend to run anymore, take my name off the ballot, period. I'm done. And I walked off the stage. So that was when I'd left myself open to get off the ballot, and they did take me off because I went the next day to the Charleston County Courthouse. And then Judge O.T. Wallace was the secretary of the Democrat Party. He's where everybody signed up with him to run. I went over to see him and said, Judge Wallace, I want you to take my name off the ballot. I'm not running. He said, what do you mean you're not running? I said, well, I don't intend to run as a Democrat anymore, ever, and I don't want my name on the ballot. He said, well, I don't know whether I can do that. I said, well, if you can't, you can't. But if I get enough votes to win, I don't intend to serve. I'm not going to serve as a Democrat. It was shortly after that, Bill, that the Republicans came to me. And we started, I guess, a dialogue of would I be willing to run as a Republican for the state Senate. And that's what started that.
I bet you're one of the few in history that quit their job first before they got another line themselves with another party.
I don't know that it happens very often. And I guess
What a great story, Tom.
I thought I was probably looked upon by a lot of people as, well, how stupid can you get? But anyway.
Were you elected as a Republican then?
Pardon me?
Did you get elected to that term?
Oh, yeah. 3 months later, 4 months later, whatever. That's when Jim Edwards and I ran for the Senate along with Tom Kennedy, who was a retired commanding general of the Charleston Air Force Base at the time, and a fine man. We ran for 3 of the 4 seats.
And how many people were Republicans at that time in the House and in the Senate?
In Columbia?
Yes, sir.
In the House is 124 members. I think there were 5 or 6 Republicans. In the Senate is 46 members. There was 1 Republican. So you have to see they were definitely in a minority. But Bill, understand that those 45 Democrats in the Senate, they were all conservative. They just hadn't done what I did and said, well, label me right. You know, I'm not liberal. I'm not a Democrat by Democrat Party standards, so I'm a Republican. Well, they never did. Republicans control the South Carolina Senate now. The Leatherman Terminal here in Charleston was named after one of the biggest Democrats ever to serve in the state Senate, but he converted to Republican before he got out. So I would say...
So, Tommy, let's talk. So when did you actually go to D.C.?
My first trip to D.C. was in January, as a congressman, in January of 81. But prior to that, before the election in November of 1980, I went up to meet with political action committees to raise money, to introduce myself to the Republican leadership, like in the...
Because you were the new kid on the block.
Yes.
And you were how old?
38.
And we discussed briefly before the podcast that I asked you a question, were there a lot of older politicians there, and what was your answer? You remember? You were the young bird. Very
young. But in my class, we called it the group that were elected with me as Republicans from across the country in 1980, there was 52 of us. So there's 435 members of the House, and we were going in as a block of 52 freshman Republicans. And really one of the honors that I'm proudest of is each class like that elects a class president. And I was elected president of the Republican freshman class of 1981. So we were still in the minority. Tip O'Neill was still the speaker. The Democrats controlled the House. But that year, Bill, the Republicans took over the U.S. Senate, and Strom Thurmond became president pro tem of the U.S. Senate and was controlled by the Republicans. The Democrats had the House, Republicans had the Senate, and the White House.
I like that it's an honest, fair assessment of what's going on the Isle of Palms. Island Vibes.
So excited about the new independent newspaper covering all the positive news on Isle of Palms. Thank you so much for this new publication.
Island Vibes rock!
Island Vibes is a deal.
You're watching the Isle of Palms podcast.
So, Tommy, I got a photograph here of everybody in the Oval Office.
Yes.
And so, who's in this picture? That's Reagan, right?
That's Reagan. Next to Reagan is me. Next to me is I'm drawing a blank right now, Bill. Floyd.
Where was he from?
He was from Columbia. Floyd Spence.
And who's that gentleman?
It looks to me, without my glasses, to be the president's chief of staff. This was Bush right here. I'd have to put on my glasses, Bill.
So, Tommy, let me ask you, because most of us, if not any of us, listening to the podcast or watching it, have been in the Oval Office. What does it feel like to be in the Oval Office?
Oh, it's almost magic. It's like, I guess it's like an old person going to Disney World. You know, when the kids go to Disney World, they see these fantastic things. When I went to Oval Office, I saw these fantastic, and it's really an Oval Office, and the big desk that presidents have used for years and years. They've got doors. They're almost like you can't see the doors. They're like they're private doors.
So, Tommy, how old were you when sitting on that couch there?
38. I was 38 years old. Yeah, then. So it was like magic, you know, to walk into the Oval Office. I mean, I'd never been in the White House. I'd only been in the Capitol twice in my life, and now I'm sitting in the White House with the president and the vice president of the United States. That was a pretty big deal, Bill. To me, it was.
Sure, it is. So this picture right here that's Reagan, obviously, and that's you. Who's that? Campbell?
That's Carol Campbell. We were flying on Air Force One.
So is that taken on Air Force One?
Yeah. That's the bulkhead behind Reagan there. He came back. You know, they have. You all would notice they have a press section, they have a VIP section, and they have the president's party itself. And of course, we were in the VIP section right behind the presidential section of Air Force One. But Reagan came back to talk to us and to the press. I mean, they loved it. You know, he was talked to everybody, answered their questions informally, things that you don't get people to do.
So you became very friendly with Reagan and Bush. But the Reagan, I want to let people know about that special story of your alignment with him when he was an announcer at the Cubs baseball games. That's where you started his career?
That's exactly right. When I first met him, he was president, or vice president. And when they introduced me to him, this is, you know, Congressman Tom Hartnett. I told him, he said, Hartnett. He said, Gabby Hartnett. I said, yes, sir. He was one of the catchers when I was broadcasting the Cubs game. He said, greatest catch of all time. He's in the Hall of Fame. I said, I realize that. He said, any relation to you? I said, well, yes, sir, he's my uncle. When it really was, and I never met the man. And he'd been dead for years. But from that time on, Reagan called me Gabby, because that was a nickname for Gabby Hartnett, the catcher. But Bill, one story I haven't told you.
Okay.
Because it's comical, too. I just mentioned that I was president of the freshman class. Well, the whole class was invited to have breakfast with the president at the White House in the East Room, I guess it was. Well, by virtue of being president, I got to sit next to the president. He's the only person who could ever wear a brown suit was Reagan. Anyway, he had on his brown suit, and he had on his beautiful white cuffs with cuff links, and he was seated next to me. Well, I'm a tea drinker, so I asked the waiter,
Sweet tea?
Oh, yeah, but this was hot
okay.
tea. This was hot tea, but I do drink sweet tea. I said, could you bring me a cup of tea? And he said, well, yes, sir. So he brought me a cup of tea.
Reagan brought you a cup of tea?
No, the waiter did.
Okay.
Well, he sat it down, but it came with a little pitcher and a little tea bag. So I was still kind of nervous and impressed to be sitting next to the president. So I went to pour my tea into the cup, and the top of the tea kettle fell off and fell into the cup and splashed the tea all over the president's white cuff and his cuff link. Well, I was absolutely devastated. And he was so, don't worry about that. That's fine. We've got other shirts. But I was so embarrassed that my tea drinking, I think I've still got the place with his name on it, with a run from where the tea splashed on it somewhere. But anyway, that was a.
So you served in Congress under how many presidents?
Just one.
Reagan.
Reagan's
but
first.
You knew George Bush well.
Yeah, but he was the vice president all that time.
Oh, I got you.
He was more available than the president was. I mean, obviously he didn't have the same security. He had the same security, but not as intense. And he came down and did fundraisers for me. I would go to barbecues at his house and the vice president's house.
And he's from Texas, so he's from the South.
Yes.
So he could relate to you, and you could relate to him.
And he was just a kind, probably the most qualified man to be president. He'd been head of the CIA, he'd been an ambassador, he'd been, you name it. I mean, he'd been in the Senate himself. He just a wonderful
Tommy,
man.
I can't have this conversation with you about Bush without showing this photograph of Bonnie and hugging Vice President Bush.
Right.
I mean, this looks so spontaneous. Was it spontaneous?
Yeah, he was just getting off. You see Air Force One in the background, Air Force Two on the background, and we were just coming off the airplane, and Bonnie and I were in the receiving line, I guess you'd call it. And so what he saw, he bypassed me and grabbed Bonnie and hugged her, and he got back to me in a minute and shook hands with me. But anyway,
That's funny.
that was right here in Charleston, right here in Charleston.
So how old were you right there in this picture?
I was probably 32 by then, something like that, maybe. Excuse me, 42 by then, some in that neighborhood.
That had to be a special time for you, right?
Oh
there.
yeah, oh yes, it was.
When you look at your time in D.C., I know it was an adventure. Okay, can you elaborate? Is there one event or one thing that you did that you contributed to the environment and society at that time that it rises to the top of your memories?
Well, there was a lot of legislation that was introduced. Republicans were in the minority. There wasn't much that we could do without the permission of the Democrats. We couldn't even move to adjourn, even if we were recognized. The president wouldn't accept, the Speaker of the House wouldn't accept our motion. But one thing that I was kind of the proudest of, and this it takes too long and uses up all of Roger's time, but somehow Reagan had gone to Europe and had placed a wreath on the tomb of the unknown German soldier, who, of course, during World War II were one of our bitterest enemies. Well, there was a whole lot of criticism. People got on the floor of the House, and how could you go to these people who were butchers and did this and did that? And it was my turn to speak. And I said, Mr. Speaker, I can understand my colleagues' thoughts on that. But, you can't make me believe that those German soldiers that fought wanted to be there. They certainly didn't want to be part of a war effort, and I'm confident they didn't want to be part of it. But they were soldiers, and they had to do what they were told, and they were ordered to be there. So they did their duty to their country as much as our soldiers did their duty to ours. And to say that it was hateful, I can't believe that every member of the German army and the Nazis were all mean, terrible people. They were just caught up in a movement that was evil, led by an evil man, and they were doing what they were ordered to do. And I think they deserve a little pity, the average German soldier.
How was your message received?
Well, I got a letter 2 or 3 days later from Nixon, who was still alive at the time, living in New York, and I got it somewhere. How much he appreciated that! What a decent speech it was. He never heard anybody speak so eloquently about whatever it was. Agreeing with what I don't want anybody to think that I think the Nazis were right. They were evil people. The leadership were horrible people. How they could live with themselves. But the little soldier in the field, he did what he was told he had to do. And I don't think we should hold it against the entire German people of the horrible things that their leadership did at that time.
What do you think your colleagues felt about it? The other fellow Republicans.
I'm sorry.
The other fellow Republicans in the Senate at the time you did that. How did they feel about that?
Well, I don't even know whether they were the president in the House at the time. They might have been in their offices. If you ever look at, they might not have been on the floor. I didn't get a standing ovation. Let's put it that way. But I just expressed myself, and I think, that didn't mean you did anything. No, it didn't mean I did anything. History is going to record.
But it's something you felt in your heart.
That's exactly right. I want to be true to myself, and that's why when I go back to leaving, we just talked about leaving the Democrat Party. I had to be true to myself, and in modern day politics, Congresswoman Liz Cheney, I never met her. I didn't know her. I met her daddy. I knew her daddy, whom I really didn't care for. But I thought she did the right thing when she stood up and said and criticized Trump in an impeachment thing. It cost her seat, obviously, or her career maybe, but she did the right thing. And that's what we need in Washington, in Charleston County, people to do the right thing.
Tommy, did you find more people going across the aisle in your days?
Yes.
Working more together, cohesively?
Very much so. We got things done. We passed the Tax Act in '86, some of the biggest bills ever passed. The Speaker of the House was the most liberal Democrat in America, but he was fair. His name was O'Neill from Massachusetts. He was fair. He listened to everybody, helped us. He and Reagan, as you read, probably used to drink a beer together at the White House, and they were both Irishmen, and they were very close friends.
So, Tommy, let's go back to you personally, if I may. So, I've been told by a woman that you spent, how many years y'all been married?
59.
59 years. Bonnie said she had some terms about going to D.C. What were her terms to you when you decided you would run?
She said that I wasn't going to Washington unless she and the children went to Washington. She insisted that we go as a family. We did. We had a wonderful time choosing a place to live in Alexandria. The kids came up and went to school. We're Catholics, and there was a little Catholic school not far from our home, so the children went to the Catholic school. Bonnie worked with the Congressional Wives Club, but we lived in an area of Alexandria where there were no children, all government workers, townhouses, complex. At 7 o'clock in the morning, they'd get in their cars and leave. At 5:30 in the afternoon, they'd get in their cars and get out and go in the house, and we never saw our neighbors. The children had nobody to really, I want to use the word play with, because they were young, 8, 9, 10 years old. And they really didn't like it. They missed their friends. They missed their school. Even Bonnie agreed that it would be better for the children if we moved back to Charleston after the first 2 years, which we did. And I commuted back and forth. And that was harder on the family. And that was one of the reasons why I'd committed to not running but for 3 terms if I were elected. And so I kept my pledge, and I did not run for a 4th term, feeling that I really needed to be closer with
Was Jim Edwards up? Were you up there at the same time Jim Edwards was up there when he was he got appointed to was it
Secretary of Energy?
Secretary of Energy. You were there at the same time?
Sure. Reagan appointed him. Now, Reagan appointed him at the behest of Strom Thurmond. Strom Thurmond was now President pro tem of the Senate, and Reagan needed him to get legislation through. So I think as a favor, he gave Thurmond 1 pick for his cabinet, and Thurmond picked Edwards. So Edwards went to Washington the same time as I did, but he went to Washington as a cabinet member. But the funny thing about it is, when he and I were running for, and this is a good story, we're running for the state senate together. We campaigned together in the same car, in the same areas.
Now let me catch people up that are listening or watching. Jim Edwards invited you to join him as a Republican to run, correct?
No.
Okay.
When I want to use the word recruited me to run for the Senate, Edwards was one of the ones pushing that. And he really wanted me to run. Well, there were 4 Senate seats, and I was the only one willing to step forward and run. So at a meeting at Jim's home, we had myself and General Kennedy and several other people. They discussed it, and they were encouraging me. And I told Jim, I said, well, Dr. Edwards, I'll run if you run. He said, well, I can't run. He said, I'm a practicing dentist. I got, I can't leave my profession. I can't get away for all that much time. I said, well, you can't and I can. I said, I got family to raise. I got people to feed. I got, bills. And I said, I tell you what, Dr. Edwards, I'll run if you run. Well, I said, Jim, Ann can't go fill up her car for gas any less than Bonnie can go fill up hers. The groceries cost us both the same. So I said, Jim, I'll run if you'll run. And he said, well, I can't. I said, well, then I can't either. Anyway, make a long story short, he agreed to run. And we recruited one other person, General Kennedy, to run for a 3rd seat and left the 4th seat vacant. So really, I guess we recruited each other. He got me to the point where I said I would run only if he would run. So that
this is for the state
Senate.
State Senate, and at that time there were way more Republicans than were Democrat, right?
Correct.
Would you please tell the audience about the story of when the Democrats were getting the committees together, please?
I can, Bill. It was almost funny because at the time when Jim and I went to Columbia for the first day of the session, everybody shook hands and said hello, and but then it got down to serious business. Well, there was only one other Republican in the Senate, Gilbert Macmillan from Aiken.
So there were 3 Republicans total.
Only one at that time. Now with Edwards and myself, it was going to be 3. So one of the jobs that they were doing was filling committee appointments. So they had a committee that got together, and the president pro tem appointed you to different committees. Well, we had to wait outside of the chamber as if we were just merely civilians watching through the glass doors as to what was going on. They wouldn't let us partake of the committee selections, so we were sort of outcast from day one. But when we finally got inside the doors, they were cordial to us, but it was a kind of a cool cordiality. But we were after a few weeks or so, we were well received by the members of the Senate, which was totally controlled by the Democrat Party.
Tommy, I'd love to sit here for hours talking about it. We got to go, but thank you for letting our audience know and documenting your time in the government in South Carolina and, of course, in D.C. This has been a real pleasure for me. I hope that our audience has enjoyed it, and thanks for your hospitality, Tommy.
Well, let me just say one more thing, Bill. You and I can't change the world. We can only try to help change that part of the world in which we live. And I would just like to encourage any members of our community who might be watching this podcast, and I hope there's a lot of them, that they would consider running for public office. We need citizen leaders. That's what our forefathers had in mind. They didn't expect people to go to the Senate or go to the House and serve for 20, 30, 40 years. It was the citizens. There's people, who was it said, here the people rule. That's about America. But now the people don't rule anymore. The politicians rule. People dislike the Congress, but love their congressman. So they won't vote against. Well, you can't change the Congress if you don't change the Congress people. And so we need to have term limits. We need to have good people take time from their busy lives to run for local office, even for higher than local office. If not, at least participate in the campaign system, help your favorite candidate get reelected or get elected, contribute to their campaigns. Money is the evil of all politics, but it's the blood that runs politics.
That's our PSA, folks. They're right there. Tommy, right from the word of Tommy Hartnett. Tommy, thanks so much.
Thank you, sir.
I mean,
it's my pleasure.
No.
And thank you to your crew that did a very noble job of putting up with us and all their interruptions.
And if anybody wants to read more about Tommy, pick up Island Vibes or go to the digital version of Island Vibes. Read islandvibes.com, and you can read an article that we published on Bonnie and You. It's a great article, Tommy. Yeah, thanks for your friendship, sir.
Thank you, sir. Maybe I talked too long, but you got to get some things in there.
That's right.
But his tobacco control, that he's got scissors, he can clip it. Anyway.
And we're at the end now, and thanks so much for letting us document this. We appreciate it very much.
Thank you for listening or watching the Isle of Palms podcast, produced by Island Vibes, the Isle of Palms upscale monthly publication. Find past and current episodes by visiting isleofpalmspodcast.com.